The book of Matthew is the first book of the New Testament and contains 28 chapters. Here is a breakdown of each chapter. Chapter 1, Genealogy of Jesus Christ and his birth narrative. Chapter 2, Visit of the wise men and the flight to Egypt. Chapter 3, The ministry of John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus. Chapter 4, The temptation of Jesus in the wilderness and the beginning of his ministry. Chapter 5, The Sermon on the Mount, including the Beatitudes and teachings on salt and light, anger, lust, divorce, oaths, retaliation, and love for enemies. Chapter 6, Continued teachings from the Sermon on the Mount, including instructions on giving, prayer, fasting, and trusting in God. Chapter 7, Concluding teachings from the Sermon on the Mount, including the narrow gate, the false prophets, and the wise and foolish builders. Chapter 8, Miracles performed by Jesus, including healing a leper, a centurion's servant, Peter's mother-in-law, and calming a storm. Chapter 9, More miracles performed by Jesus, including healing a paralyzed man, raising a girl from the dead, and healing a woman with an issue of blood. Chapter 10, Jesus sends out the 12 disciples to preach and perform miracles. Chapter 11, John the Baptist's inquiry about Jesus, Jesus' response, and a warning to those who reject him. Chapter 12, Jesus defends his disciples for picking grain on the Sabbath, heals a man with a withered hand, and confronts the Pharisees for accusing him of being in league with Beelzebub. Chapter 13, Parables about the kingdom of heaven, including the sower, the weeds, the mustard seed, the yeast, the hidden treasure, the pearl, and the dragnet. Chapter 14, More miracles performed by Jesus, including feeding the 5,000, walking on water, and healing many people. Chapter 15, Jesus confronts the Pharisees and teachers of the law for their traditions, heals a Canaanite woman's daughter, and feeds the 4,000. Chapter 16, Jesus rebukes the Pharisees and warns his disciples to beware of their teaching, and Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ. Chapter 17, The transfiguration of Jesus, his healing of a demon-possessed boy, and his prophecy of his death and resurrection. Chapter 18, Teachings on humility and forgiveness, and instructions for dealing with sin in the church. Chapter 19, Jesus' teachings on divorce, marriage, and the rich young ruler. Chapter 20, The parable of the workers in the vineyard, Jesus' prophecy of his death and resurrection, and James and John's request for places of honor. Chapter 21, Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, cleansing of the temple, and parables of the two sons, the tenants, and the wedding banquet. Chapter 22, Jesus' teachings on the greatest commandment, the Pharisees' question about the resurrection, and the parable of the wedding banquet continued. Chapter 23, Jesus' 7 woes to the Pharisees, lament over Jerusalem, and prophecy of the destruction of the temple. Chapter 24, Jesus' Olivet Discourse, including prophecies of the destruction of Jerusalem, his second coming, and the signs of the end times. Chapter 25, Parables about the kingdom of heaven, including the 10 virgins, the talents, and the sheep and the goats. Chapter 26, Jesus is anointed by a woman with expensive perfume, and Judas agrees to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. Jesus shares the Last Supper with his disciples, predicting his betrayal and Peter's denial. Chapter 27, Jesus is arrested, tried, and sentenced to death by crucifixion. He is mocked, beaten, and crucified, and dies on the cross. He is buried in a tomb, and a guard is placed at the entrance. Chapter 28, On the third day, Jesus rises from the dead and appears to his disciples. He commissions them to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. He promises to be with them always, to the very end of the age. The book of Matthew is a powerful and insightful account of Jesus' life and teachings, and it continues to inspire and guide Christians today.